morning, Mr. Griffin.
Good morning, Chair. Chair, this week is Mental Health Awareness Week. The theme this year is community. According to the Mental Health Foundation, being part of a safe, positive community is vital for our well-being. Communities can provide a sense of belonging, safety, support in hard times, and give us a sense of purpose. The Inquiry would like to acknowledge Mental Health Awareness Week. Chair, today we will be hearing from Deborah Coles of the organisation Inquest. There are broad themes to her evidence, which include the inadequacies of post-death investigatory processes, particularly from a family point of view. Inquest are calling for an independent investigatory body, and allied to this is Inquest's call for a national oversight mechanism to consider recommendations and the like arising from inquests and other forms of investigation. Another theme in the evidence will be the absence of a coherent and complete set of statistics in relation to those who die in mental health detention, and Inquest's relevant casework and what it reveals about the national picture and the Essex picture, the serious and concerning themes arising, including of a suggested closed culture at EPUT. Ms. Coles' evidence will highlight serious concerns from the perspective of her organisation and her own personal experience. In the afternoon, Chair, we will hear evidence from EPUT's Dr. Milind Corrale, who will be asked about the assessments process. His evidence will not touch on individual cases. That does mean, though, that today's evidence and information may be distressing in certain respects and difficult to listen to, including Ms. Coles and what she is going to tell us about Inquest's casework. For some, it may not be possible to sit through this session, and anyone in the hearing room is welcome to leave at any point. And again, I would like to remind people that emotional support is available for all of those who require it. The well-being of those participating in the inquiry is extremely important to the inquiry. And we have support staff from Hestia, an experienced provider of emotional support here today. And as I've said previously, for each day of the hearing, there's a private room downstairs where you can talk to Hestia support staff if you require emotional support. The Hestia staff are wearing orange scarves. Would you mind just raising your hand? And orange lanyards. You can speak to them directly, or if you want to, come up to a member of the inquiry team and we can put you in touch with them. We are wearing purple lanyards. And if you're watching online, information about available emotional support can be found on the Lampard Inquiry website. That's lampardinquiry.org.uk, and under the support tab, which is near the top right-hand corner. We want, Chair, all of those engaging with the inquiry to feel safe and supported. Chair, with that, I'm going to ask that we call Deborah Coles and ask that she comes to the table, please.
Welcome, Ms. Coles. Nice to see you.
I, Deborah Coles, do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Would you provide your full name, please?
Deborah Jane Coles.
Ms. Coles, you provided the inquiry with a 47-page statement dated the 1st of April. Can you confirm that its contents are true and accurate?
Yes, I can.
Do you have the statement in front of you?
I do.
Please feel free to refer to it as you wish. Your statement and the exhibits that you've provided stand as part of your evidence, and so I won't be asking you about every aspect of your witness statement today. This is an introductory phase of the inquiry's hearings, and the focus in your evidence today will be on important general and systemic issues. Mm-hmm. May I ask you about names? In your statement, you refer to people who died as mental health inpatients in Essex. We'll come on to this later, but it's from your paragraph 58. And this is to illustrate and provide an evidence base for some of the points that you go on to make. Is it correct that Inquest has not, at this stage, provided to the inquiry the names of the individual deceased to whom you refer there?
Correct.
Does Inquest agree to work carefully and responsibly with the inquiry in order to make further disclosure to the inquiry of the names and further details in the cases on which you've relied in your statement?
Of course, yeah.
Before I go any further, I'm going to pause because I understand there's something you'd like to say.
Yes, I just wanted to say something to the families involved in this inquiry, and in particular I want to acknowledge the incredible strength, courage and determination of families who've been relentless in advocating for their loved ones in both life and in death, and in having to fight for truth, justice and accountability. And we know the trauma of your bereavement, but also the trauma in your dealings with the trust and the lack of candour and denial and false promises of learning and action, and how re-traumatising that has been. And this inquiry, I think, is an absolute testament to your perseverance. When someone you love is taken into mental health care, you expect them to be looked after and kept safe. The team at Inquest stand both in solidarity but in support for what you've achieved, but also recognise the emotional and physical impact of what you've been and are still going through. You've ensured that a light is being shone behind the closed doors of these mental health settings and focusing a light on the candour of the trust. And the truth must come out, and it's vital that your questions are asked and answered, and that through this inquiry we see the transformative systemic change that is so needed. Thank you.
I'd like to ask you about yourself first. Have you worked for the charity Inquest since 1989,
Yes.
becoming its co-director in 1994 and executive director in 2017?
I have.
And let's just check in what capacity you're giving your evidence today. Are you speaking as CEO of Inquest, i.e. on behalf of the organisation, in a personal capacity, or both?
Both.
Do you hold and have you held a range of other positions outside Inquest, including membership of the Independent Advisory Panel on Deaths in Custody, or IAPDC?
Yes.
Could you just explain in brief, what does the panel do?
The panel is a cross-government-sponsored panel, both by the Ministry of Justice, Home Office and Department of Health, and it provides independent advice to the Ministerial Board on Deaths in Custody. Its key aim is to prevent deaths in custody, including those detained under the Mental Health Act. It conducts research and I think it has been a very helpful addition in terms of exposing some of the issues around deaths, but particularly the deaths that this inquiry are concerned with. And I can talk about that a little bit more.
Well, as part of its role, does the IAPDC publish reports covering aspects of its work?
Aspects of its work, and I think importantly, a statistical bulletin looking at the number of deaths across state institutions.
Chair, I understand that you wish it to be made known that you were interim chair of the IAPDC for a period from 2015 to 2016.
Thank you, that's great.
Can we now move on to talk about Inquest, the organisation? So Inquest is a charity, is it, that was founded in 1981?
Correct.
What's the focus of its work?
I suppose our key work is working alongside families bereaved after what we would call state-related deaths. So that includes deaths in custody and detention, including mental health detention.
Can we just cover those so that people are aware? Clearly, we're going to be interested in your mental health-related work, but does Inquest also, as part of its remit, consider deaths in police custody in prisons or young offenders institutions, and also in immigration detention.
Yes.
Have I missed anything?
No. And then we also work on deaths that raise questions about other multi-agency failings. So we've done some work on learning disability settings, deaths and learning disability settings, or where state and corporate accountability are in question. So that's included work around the Hillsborough football disaster and the Grenfell Tower fire.
Thank you. And is an important part of your work, inquest work, does that relate to post-death investigations?
Yes.
Can you just explain what that term encompasses, please?
So our work is, and our casework team that work directly with families help families navigate the post-death processes. And I think what people don't always realise is not only is a family dealing with or a traumatic death, but then there are legal processes that follow. So there are post-death investigations, and for the purposes of this inquiry, that will be the investigations conducted by the trusts or private providers, or an independent investigation if one is instructed. And then you have the inquest system. And so the role of our organisation is to help families navigate those processes, to make sure that families are informed about what their legal rights are. Because what we too often find is that there is an information deficit after a death happens, and it's very difficult to understand exactly what is going to happen, not least when you're dealing with the trauma and the grief of having a loved one die in a place that you thought they would be safe.
Thank you very much. And in fact, we'll come on to talk about post-death investigations a little bit more later on. Does Inquest work across England and Wales principally, but occasionally further afield? Yes,
our primary area is England and Wales, but we have also been doing some work, well, I've been doing some work in Scotland, particularly around how deaths in Scotland are investigated, and I can talk about that particularly in the context of the National Oversight Mechanism.
Thank you. You've touched on this already, but could you provide a little bit more of an explanation of the role that bereaved people play in an inquest?
I mean, I think at the heart of our organisation are the experiences and voices of bereaved people, and our work with families informs all of our policy and campaigning work for systemic change. We have a family reference group made up of families who've been through inquests, a number of whom have had loved ones die whilst receiving mental health care. We also hold regular family forums, family listening days, where families can come together and talk about their experiences.
We'll actually come on to think a little bit more about the family listening days later on. Carry on.
So, I mean, I think what's probably important about the work that we do is that the work is directly informed by the day-to-day work that we do with bereaved people. And not only is that important in terms of our policy work, but also in trying to make organisations aware of what families need after a death. And obviously that's been work going over kind of nearly 4 decades, well, it is 4 decades before I joined. But our work is to try and not only prevent future deaths, but also try and improve the treatment of bereaved families more generally, and try and minimise the trauma of those post-death processes.
Thank you very much. You say in your statement, this is paragraph 6, that families are experts by experience. Can you explain a little bit more what you mean by that?
Well, nobody knows better what it's like to have the death of a loved one in an institution that is ordinarily a closed institution, and where a family is reliant on that closed institution for every aspect of their loved one's treatment and care, and then when things go wrong, they best know what it's like to go through the system of trying to find out the truth. And I think it's important to understand that the processes that follow deaths are protracted. They can take a long time for an investigation or an inquest to take place. And what we will no doubt talk about is the experiences of many families who feel very very shut out from those processes that are there and should be there to answer those families' questions about how and why their loved one died in a place where they should have been safe. So when we talk about experts by experiences, that is a recognition that nobody knows better than bereaved people themselves about what it's like to go through those processes. But importantly, they best know what needs to change.
Thank you very much. Just now on to how Inquest is organised. Is it organised around casework, media and policy, family engagement, specific projects, operations, those general areas?
Yes, that's correct.
And does Inquest undertake its work with a relatively small number of staff and executive and governance by a board?
That's correct. I mean, I think sometimes people overestimate the size of the organisation because we are the only organisation that is doing this work. And that comes with it many challenges. I think the other important thing to say is that we are completely independent of government and we don't take government funding because we recognise the importance to families of our independence and our ability to speak truth to power, to be able to use our evidence in a kind of campaigning and policy way and to try and inform change. And I think one of the things I perhaps should have said around families, I mean, the other important role that Inquest plays alongside families is to try and ensure that the voices and experiences of families are heard by parliamentarians and policymakers, because I think the team can go off and talk to people, but actually the people you will remember, and I'm sure the inquiry this will resonate with the inquiry, that actually it's the voices of bereaved people who you will remember, their stories, those human stories about what has happened.
Thank you. Well, I want to now ask you about the increase over the years that Inquest has experienced in its casework in mental health settings. You describe in your witness statement, this is from paragraph 8, Inquest's involvement from the early 1990s and up until recent time in a range of inquiries and commissions and the like concerning deaths in mental health settings. Was Inquest's early casework in relation to deaths where the deceased had been experiencing mental health conditions initially in the police and prison context?
Yes.
Did mental health inpatient deaths become an increasing part of your casework?
It did, and in fact, in preparing for this statement, I was then reminded of my first experience quite early on in my career of giving evidence to the Louis Blom Cooper inquiry into the situation within Ashworth Hospital, and that was in 1992, which interestingly followed a Channel 4 documentary that had exposed ill treatment at the hospital, uncovering abuse, and was particularly concerned with the kind of brutalising and oppressive nature of what was going on. And that inquiry, I think, was probably the first inquiry, I think, in my experience, that gave a kind of insight into what was going on in mental health detention.
So just to pause there, that's 1992?
That was in 1992, yes. And I think because we had been aware of the impact of mental ill health on people's experience of prison and policing, particularly around excessive and disproportionate use of force. By way of example, we were then becoming more aware of deaths of mental health inpatients.
Thank you. You describe in your statement that there were important legal developments, including in a case where SEPT was a defendant. This is paragraph 16. In essence, were those legal developments decisions from the House of Lords and then the Supreme Court in two legal cases in 2008 and 2012 concerning Article 2 of the European Convention on Human Rights and people detained or de facto detained in psychiatric hospitals?
Yes, that's right.
What effect did those decisions have on Inquest's casework?
I mean, I think by that time we had done further work. I don't know if you're going to take me to the earlier paragraphs, but we had started doing more work on mental health deaths. But obviously, these were two significant judgments, and particularly around the recognition that the Article 2 duty applied to people in detention and de facto detention, which was significant in the sense of, I suppose, an acknowledgement that these were deaths that warranted proper, public scrutiny. And we had seen a corresponding increase in the number of families that were turning to Inquest for help in the absence of any other organisation. I mean, I think it's just important to note, for context, that none of the mental health organisations work with bereaved families, so there is nowhere else for families to go. At one point in my early years at Inquest, the mental health charity Mind had a legal department that did take on some of these cases, but nobody does this work. And so in a way, we were filling a gap, and we recognised just how important it was that, deaths in another closed institution should be, properly investigated, but those families needed to be supportive, and in the same way as other families, they needed to be aware of what their legal rights were in terms of accessing, help and support.
By 2014, had mental health inpatient deaths come to make up a significant proportion of Inquest's casework?
Yes, yeah.
I think you may have described how it came about generally. Are there any other explanations for this increase that you haven't yet given?
I suppose because of the nature of our work and the fact that we'd been involved in, I don't know whether you want to take me to the death of Rocky Bennett.
We'll come on to that in a moment.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I think what happened was there was kind of corresponding, people became more aware of our organisation and the work we were doing. And we were also, by 2014, not only did the deaths make up a significant proportion of our casework, but it became clear that we were seeing the kind of recurring nature of failings in mental health care that we were concerned about, and we were becoming more and more concerned about the system of investigation.
We'll come on to all of that.
Okay.
But you mentioned in your statement, this is paragraph 18, that even at this stage, key themes were emerging from your work in this area. Mm-hmm. Were these national themes rather than focused on one part of the country?
Oh, but definitely national.
Can you provide us with an indication of what those themes were, please?
Yes, I would say the first one was the lack of advice and support for families after deaths occur, but then failures to involve families in the care of their loved one whilst in mental health settings, lack of support in the community, and the significance of that being that many people were becoming in serious crisis and trauma and distress resulting in detention because there was the lack of support in the community. Familiar issues around observations, poor quality of care, poor assessments. I mean, I think what's quite depressing really for me in thinking about the work that Inquest has done over such a long period is that sadly these are all too familiar themes today. I think the other thing I would say is that, it was quite difficult when we first started working in this area because some of our work around police and prison deaths was making us aware about how prisons and policing were an inappropriate response to people in mental health crisis. And so we were advocating that there should be better mental health services and better support. At the same time, we were seeing mental health settings where you, at the very least, expected somebody to be safe because by the very nature you expect a mental health setting to be therapeutic, to have care at its heart, and yet we were seeing many of these really concerning features. The other one I should mention is around the overuse of restraint, concerning use of restraint, and also isolation and segregation, seclusion.
What approximate proportion of Inquest's current casework comprises inquests into deaths arising within mental health settings?
I think probably it would be fair to say about a third. I mean, we've, the real challenge that I need to kind of just, be candid about is that, we have far more families coming to Inquest than we can offer support to. So we are currently kind of rolling out a new way of working to try and make sure that whether or not we can give somebody full casework support, at the very least we want to make sure that our resources are made available. We're going to be holding workshops because there is a real gap here, and what families need when the worst thing has happened is they do need access to proper advice and support.
And some of that will be available online?
Absolutely. We have online resources, a handbook, etc.
You've spoken about the different things that Inquest does. I want to look at a couple of them briefly, please. First of all, your monitoring role, and then we'll come on to look at casework. Okay. What does Inquest monitoring and evaluation work involve?
Are you talking...
So this is,
do you want to take me...
So this is, well, we can look at paragraph 41 if you like. You talk about carrying out comprehensive monitoring and collating of statistics in relation to deaths in police custody, but not the equivalent in relation to deaths in mental health detention. Yeah. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? And then also about your monitoring as opposed to your casework role generally?
I mean, one of the things that we think is important is trying to make publicly available comprehensive data on who is dying and where they're dying in places of detention or in and following, for example, police contact. So we monitor and collate statistics, and we're able to do that because we draw on the official sources available as well as freedom of information requests.
We'll come on to talk a little bit more about those official sources.
Okay. But unfortunately, we're not able to carry out that formal monitoring in relation to mental health deaths because there has never existed a central comprehensive source of authoritative data of either mental health inpatient deaths or the deaths of those who've died in the community following contact with or under the care of mental health services. And this has been an issue that Inquest have raised for decades.
Well, we'll look at a little bit of that in a moment.
Okay.
So there's no formal monitoring, But is there in fact informal monitoring, for example, through prevention of future death reports?
Yes, I mean, all of our work is informed by our monitoring and collating of statistics where available, our monitoring of investigations and inquests into state-related deaths, and of course that will include the outcomes of inquests, both in terms of jury narrative conclusions and prevention of future death reports. And it's important just to make the point about jury conclusions, because there is no central collation of jury conclusions, which can be extremely important in understanding whether or not any system failings have been identified during the course of the inquest. So where we can and where we've been working with a family, we will collate those, and then we use that evidence to inform our policy work, and particularly our work to try and effect change, be that in the post-death processes or in regard to the issues that have been raised by the particular case and the subsequent evidence that's come out of an inquest.
Thank you. Well, we'll look at both what Inquest has been doing in relation to post-death issues and also statistics in a moment. Can we move, though, now first on to casework? In general terms, what casework consist of? You cover this in paragraph 22.
Yeah. So, I mean, I suppose our key motivation is to make sure that families are supported to navigate the processes that follow a death, and know how, well, and I suppose to enable and empower them to play a meaningful part in the investigation processes. And I think it's important to just kind of bear in mind that, as we will all know from experiencing the death of a loved one, you know, your initial kind of response is one of grief and dealing with those kind of post death processes, like the funeral, and, you know, being with family and friends and loved ones. But where you have a death that has taken place in an institution, your ability to grieve and your bereavement is impacted by the very experience of having an investigation. You've had a death of a loved one in an institution. They hold all the resources, they hold all the knowledge, and you are having to try and find out what has happened at a time, as I say, when you're grieving and you're trying to hold, you know, your life together and support other family members. And so our role really is to try and make sure that you have access to information, you have access to a lawyer if that's what you want, and we would advise families to seek legal representation, because it can be extremely important whilst you're navigating the post-death processes, the funerals, to know that there's somebody who can be beginning to start to get the information together to begin to help you to understand why a death and how and why a death has happened. So will a caseworker work along, if a lawyer is instructed, does the caseworker continue and work alongside the lawyer? Irrespective of whether a lawyer is instructed or not, a caseworker will. And as I say, I mean, the other way of supporting is by trying to give families access to other forums where they can meet other families, where they can have kind of that informal support. Because one thing that families, you know, tell us time and time again is, you know, you're thrown into a really alien process. There's very often an information kind of deficit. It can be a very isolating and lonely place. And as I said earlier, it can take a very long time before you begin to get answers. And many families will tell us that they can't begin to grieve until they know the truth about what has happened.
So they put their grief on hold during this difficult time.
Absolutely.
Does the casework that you're talking about also form part of your information base? So you're talking about monitoring and so
Yes.
on. But is Inquest as an organisation also learning a lot about what's happening on the ground through its involvement in its casework?
Absolutely. And I mean, all of our work is informed by that evidence base.
And what is that? I mean, what kind of information, where you're working on a case with a caseworker, what kind of information is Inquest as an organisation gathering and recording?
Well, as much as possible with a relatively difficult database. You know, as an NGO, I'm sure people will understand that we don't have those great sophisticated systems. We'd love them, but we don't. But we will...
Can you remind me how big an organisation it is?
At the moment, we are a team of 16.
16.
Yeah. But only four caseworkers and one part-time casework assistant. So sorry, the question was...
Well, I was asking about the information that
So
Inquest as an organisation gathers through its casework. You also address this at paragraph 31 of your statement.
Thank you. We will document as much information as possible, and that will be everything from how was a family informed about a death, what information were they given about where to go for advice and support, how candid was the information that was given to them by trusts and private providers, and then obviously, you know, as the case develops, as much information that we can glean from the different processes. So, you know, I would say that, you know, we have a huge amount of information about families' experiences of these processes going back decades.
And as you said, does the information that you're gathering through your casework go into your database?
Yeah. Prior to the database, obviously it was handwritten in folders and files, which we still have.
And the information in the database, you cover this in paragraph 31, is used for various purposes. Can you indicate what they are?
Well, I think, you know, it enables us as an organisation to draw out trends and patterns, both in terms of, you know, families' experiences of the post-death processes through to the issues that play out, you know, through the investigations and through the inquests. And, you know, in a sense, I think what we're trying to do is, you know, all of our work is about prevention. All of our work is to try and stop the deaths happening, and kind of shining a light behind, you know, the closed doors of institutions. But also, I think rightly, it's about ensuring that these, you know, that these institutions that owe individuals a duty of care, and you've already talked about Article 2, but, you know, it's important to say that, you know, people who go into detention are completely dependent on others for their treatment and care. And in a sense, that's an extremely vulnerable position to be in. So it's also about ensuring that their human rights are respected and that they're treated with dignity and respect. And where there are human rights abuses, and in particular, you know, inhuman and degrading treatment, that those are brought to light in the hope that we can inform the change. Because every family that we work with will say that we want the truth about what has happened, and we want people to be honest and open about what has happened. But nothing can bring your loved one back, but they hope that by going through these protracted, distressing processes, they hope that something positive can come out. And that can give meaning to people's loss. That can be quite cathartic. It can be healing, but only if they see the corresponding change happen. And I think what is sometimes forgotten is that these processes by their very nature are re-traumatizing. You will hear time and time again organisations say, oh, you know, we will, lessons will be learned. The most overused.
Well, we'll come on to some of this a little later on. But I mean, as I understand what you're saying, is that there can be a very important element in your casework where a loved one has died, with the possibility that that death is not in vain, because the hope is that meaningful change will be affected from the learning that comes out of it.
Yeah.
And if the processes aren't in place for that learning, then there are problems in grieving and so on.
Yes, and I would say even if the processes are not in place and you have a situation where you've had, you know, a very poor investigation, the inquest can then play an important role, and that can help to expose the truth and, you know, can help identify system failings. But I think what, again, is not recognised is what it's like to be a family who've gone through all those processes, have been told that there will be action, and then they learn of another death in similar circumstances, and that can be extremely traumatic. And I have to say that's something that, you know, speaking about my work with an inquest, it's the thing that makes me the most angry and frustrated and upset, is that, you know, we're still seeing those familiar issues.
I'm just staying with the subject of the data and the information that you as an organisation are able to gather. You say this at paragraph 42 of your witness statement, and this is something you've touched on. However, we do not carry out formal monitoring in relation to mental health deaths. This is because there's no central comprehensive source of authoritative data of either mental health inpatient deaths or the deaths of those who've died in the community following contact with or under the care of mental health services. You then have a footnote which says this: although we analyse data from our casework to inform the direction of strategic and policy work, to set casework priorities, make remit decisions, and for the purpose of specific reports, we do not therefore routinely collate and analyse our data as part of a formal monitoring role. The lack of a central data set, and we're going to come on to talk about all of that, also means that although we review case files to ensure any information published or shared is accurate, data arising from our casework is not statistically representative of the national picture. I just wanted to ask you about the last part of that. Data arising from our casework is not statistically representative of the national picture. Could you just explain what that means?
I mean, I think what it means is the fact that, you know, there is no corresponding data that we can go to say how many deaths there have been in particular, under particular trusts or private providers. It's a really disparate picture. And so our casework is only as representative as the families that we can work with or the families that come to us. But I would say that, you know, we work with families across the country, and I am confident that the trends and patterns that we draw out reflect many of the issues that this inquiry is looking at.
Thank you. I'm going to ask that a document's put up on a part of your statement's put up on the screen. Could you put up core bundle page 185 and expand paragraph 54, please? We can see here that you say, by way of overview, and sorry, this is dealing with data held by inquest. By way of overview, during the period under review by the inquiry, inquest has worked on a total of 7,460 cases across all types of deaths across England and Wales. This includes cases where we provided ongoing casework, but also where we provided initial advice. Of those, 1,843 are marked within our casework system as having been mental health related, and this will include the deaths of people who were detained under the Mental Health Act, receiving mental health care in hospital but not detained under the Mental Health Act, and deaths in the community. these deaths may also involve other agencies, for example, the police or the local authority. Well, first point, does that give us an idea of the extent of your casework?
Yes.
There's reference here to deaths in the community and involving other agencies, which may not come within the inquiry's terms of reference, depending on the particular circumstances. But I'd like to, at this stage, consider any other caveats the inquiry should have in mind when we're looking at or considering your data. And I'm staying with paragraph 54 and 55. In fact, can we look actually at the footnote at the bottom of the page, of the same page? The inquiry will note that these figures have been extracted using information recorded by our casework system and that they should be used as estimates only. For example, the dates used to identify cases within the relevant period refer to dates on which the case was opened on our system, not the date of death.
Yeah.
Further factors to be taken into account are then set out in the following paragraph. So that's something else we just need to bear in mind when we're looking or considering the information that you're providing to us. Could you take that down, please? And at paragraph 55, you list further limitations we need to bear in mind when considering inquest data.
Yeah.
To summarise, are they that the purpose for which inquest collects data is primarily to deliver its casework rather than to conduct a formal monitoring role, at least in relation to mental health, and the way it collects data is structured accordingly?
Yes.
And also the breadth of your remit as an organisation, including in relation to mental health, reflects your, it's a point you've just made, your casework capacity and operational realities, the amount of people, the amount of cases you can actually take on.
And particularly in mental health, such was the demand, we've had to make some very difficult decisions about those deaths that we can work in detail on. And, and sadly that, that's the reality of our funding situation. And that's particularly impacted on deaths in the community, which we started working on because we were so concerned about the number of people who were dying either for want of support from mental health services or who, in our view, had been discharged prematurely from mental health services to no proper support in the community. And also our work situates deaths in their broader kind of social and political context. And one of the concerns we had around mental health was that we were seeing cuts to frontline services, which in our view were impacting on people's ability to get proper, good mental health support in the community. And I think that alongside increasing austerity and inequality meant that we were seeing a real need for scrutiny of those deaths. But we, as I say, have had to make some difficult decisions purely because of our resources, not because we didn't recognise that those deaths needed, those families, importantly, needed that support.
Thank you very much. Just staying with other matters we just need to bear in mind when considering inquest data and information. Again, it's a matter you've touched on, but inquest record keeping has changed over time, starting with those manuscript records you were telling us about, transitioning to digital databases, with record keeping improving over time?
I would hope so, yes.
And I think, just staying on that theme, there was limited functionality of your first digital database, but that's a situation, as I understand it from your statement, which improved with a later version or versions.
Yeah, and I think you should also bear in mind that in the early years of doing this work, there was very limited disclosure to families. When I first started at the organisation, you were lucky if you turned up at an inquest with anything other than maybe a post-mortem report or a kind of front sheet with information on it. So of course that, as families importantly have been given more rights, and also as, the Article 2 of the Human Rights Act has impacted on the way in which inquests are held. there has been more corresponding information. So, of course, you know, that's...
Well, that is an important point. So earlier in the period of interest to this inquiry, we go back to 2000.
Yeah.
One of the reasons you as an organisation may have less information is that families themselves were receiving less information.
Yeah.
Thank you. I want to now ask you broadly about cases falling in the inquiry's terms of reference, as you've assessed them to be. Have you, in fact, gone to individual case files held by Inquest for the information, and we'll look at that information a little later on, about cases you've determined fall within the inquiry's terms of reference?
Yes.
Were you able to review cases that were held? I mean, do you have any files that are still in paper form, or has everything been transitioned onto a database?
Oh, we have many files in paper form.
Have you been able to review those for the purpose of the information that you provided to the inquiry?
I don't think we have. I think because of the fact you were looking at 2000 onwards, I think those were all, from memory, those were all within the database.
So the paper files relate to an earlier period?
They do, yes. I mean, for example, in preparation for the statement, I reviewed the Louis Blom Cooper inquiry, because that was obviously predated digitalisation, and I looked at kind of my statement for that by way of example.
To what extent do you think that limitations, inevitably, in the digital database mean you may not have identified all potentially relevant Essex cases that you hold?
I mean, I feel confident with the information we've provided in this statement. So I hope it's, I mean, I'm confident it's representative of the deaths that this inquiry is concerned with.
Thank you. So the casework service that Inquest provides, when normally would that come to an end in any particular case?
It would usually come to an end at the conclusion of the inquest, the formal relationship. But of course, many families are interested in the process of policy change. So it may be that families will remain involved in the organisation and maybe come to some of the online connection cafes that we organise. They may play a role in some of our policy and campaigning work.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you about next. In fact, on the basis of all of the information you gather from whatever source,
yes,
does Inquest also produce reports and provide evidence of matters within its knowledge and experience for a range of different organisations, including parliamentary and health bodies?
Yes, and we've been, I mean, you may come on to the...
Well, we're going to look at David Rocky Bennett in a second.
Oh, okay. But I'm also thinking of our family listening days.
Well, we're going to come on to those as well.
Fine.
Can we come on then to the David Bennett inquiry, which reported in 2003, so towards the beginning of the period of the inquiries, within the inquiry's terms of reference.
Yeah.
Who was David Bennett? You touch on all of this from paragraph 11.
Yeah. So David, known as Rocky Bennett, was a patient at an NHS-run clinic in Norfolk, and he died as a direct result of the restraint that was used against him. He died of asphyxia. He was restrained over a long period, and I think that for Inquest, this was a death that was a reminder of the violence and racism that we had seen in police and prison context, and it was the first, probably the first death that we had worked on in detail with his family.
Was there an inquest in 2001?
There was.
And did the jury return a verdict of accidental death aggravated by neglect?
Neglect, yes.
And say that the cause of death was due to prolonged restraint, as well as long-term antipsychotic drug therapy?
Yes. I think we were fortunate at the time that there was a coroner who, from recollection, I believe, had got some mental health, had got a background in mental health. And there was an inquest in which the family were represented and were able to play a proper part in that process. And it was a full, I think, a full and actually focused importantly on the use of restraint.
Well, we'll look at aspects of that in a moment. The independent inquiry into the death of David Bennett, reported in December 2003, you speak in paragraph 12 of your statement of inquest's evidence to that inquiry and what it highlighted.
Yeah. I mean, I think what's important here is that I think similar to this inquiry, it was the family's determination that something positive could come out of his death that informed the decision to set up that independent inquiry, to which we gave evidence, and we raised a number of issues. And I think importantly, to address your earlier point, we highlighted the lack of data to enable monitoring of deaths and mental health detention, so that it was difficult to understand not only who was dying but why they were dying. And that for us was particularly important in the context of race and ethnicity.
Did you also highlight issues in post-death investigations?
We did.
We're going to look at the report and pick up on those.
Okay.
So the inquiry went on to make various recommendations itself, didn't it?
It did, yes.
Could you put up, please, exhibits bundle, page 14339, and expand the right-hand column? Thank you. Can you actually read that? I'll read the relevant
I can.
bits. So we can see at the top there, sudden death in psychiatric hospitals. The inquiry found the evidence relating to sudden deaths in psychiatric hospitals to be unclear.
Mm-hmm.
The statistics were unsatisfactory, so it was difficult to draw clear conclusions from them. We recommend that more detailed statistics are kept so that it can be known how many patients in mental health institutions die when being restrained or within a short time thereafter, with details of their ethnic grouping. And if we drop down a little bit, we can see Inquest told us that since 1996 there'd been monitoring of the ethnic origin of people who die in custody, but this did not include deaths of detained patients. So is that going back to the point about different collection of data for those in police or prison detention?
Yes, I mean it followed some lobbying from recollection of the United Nations in highlighting the lack of data and the lack of any kind of monitoring of race and ethnicity, and that then prompted this to be looked at in the context of police and prison, but not in the context of deaths of detained patients. I mean, Yeah.
So may I just finish the paragraph?
You
because
may, yeah.
It says there was a gap in information, not only about who was dying, but why they were dying.
Yeah.
And,
I mean,
yes.
what I was going to say is what is really quite depressing about this is that this is the situation that remains today. And you will note from the independent advisory panel's most recent statistical bulletin that they make the very same point.
Well, we're going to be tracking this point through a couple of different reports over time in a moment. Does the inquiry report go on to say that the inquiry notes that coroners make recommendations from time to time and proposes that those recommendations should be monitored and collated centrally? And Inquest told us that the failure by the NHS to provide information and support to families after a death had a highly detrimental effect on families' mental health. Again, picking up on points you've already made to us. Can we therefore see recommendations there covering, as you've just said, unsatisfactory statistics into an important aspect of mental health care? And in fact, the report does go on, this is recommendation number 11 in the report, to make this recommendation that the Department of Health should collate and publish annual statistics on the deaths of all psychiatric inpatients, which should include ethnicity. And we can see in the highlighted or expanded part there also the recommendation in relation to coroners' recommendations and that they should be centrally collected and monitored. Would you please go to the next page and expand the left-hand column just at the top? So the next page, Thank you very much. So this is continuing on from what we've just been looking at. And we can see here a paragraph starting, families should have access to information about where to go for help after a death of a family member who was in a mental health institution. Again, picking up on points you've already made to us. And can we see towards about halfway down, if there was an investigation after the death, families should have an effective access to that investigation process from the beginning to the end. The investigative body should be an independent body. One was left with the feeling that some people's lives did not have equal worth with others. And so here we see, a recommendation for an independent investigative body.
Indeed.
Could you take that down, please? You refer in your statement to concerns, this is paragraph 47, but we don't need to go to it, over deep inequalities in access to mental health care and outcomes, particularly in respect of black people. Mm-hmm. Is that, so we saw it here in relation to a report over 20 years ago. To what extent have those issues improved over time?
They haven't. And I think I've provided examples of more recent literature. I mean, I think there's an acknowledgement by some, at least, that racism is embedded into those structures of healthcare, and we know that black people are more likely to enter the mental health system via the criminal justice system. They are more likely to be detained under the Mental Health Act, more not likely to be placed under community treatment orders, and then when they're actually in detention, that they are more likely to be subject to violence, the use of restraint and isolation, particularly prone restraint. And I think, this has been the subject of research.
Is one of the relevant reports which you provided to the inquiry a rapid review from February 2022, the NHS Race Health Observatory report, Ethnic Inequalities in Healthcare. And does that pick up on some of the points you've just been telling us about?
It does.
Thank you. Chair, I'm about to move on to a new topic. We've been going for about an hour and 10 minutes. Would this be a good time for a 15-minute break?
Of course.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. See you in 15 minutes. Thank you.
So I want to come on now to the topic of investigations, please. And you've mentioned family listening days and information that you can give to this inquiry about themes arising from those. You set out in your statement, this is paragraph 38, what, as you put it, families have been telling Inquest since you started holding those family listening days in 2010. And your statement refers to the reports of 3 family listening days in support of various points that you then go on to make. And can we just deal, first of all, with what those family listening day reports were? First of all, the report of the IAPDC, Independent Advisory Panel on Deaths in Custody Family Listening Day, which was held in 2011. That involved families who have, as it says, direct experience of the investigation and inquest system following the death of a relative whilst in mental health detention. Was that organised by Inquest on behalf of the IAPDC?
Yeah, we were commissioned to run it on behalf of the IAP. The
next is Inquest's report on the CQC Family Listening Day in 2016. And the stated purpose there is to gather evidence to inform the CQC's review of how NHS trusts investigate and learn from deaths. So that's not limited to mental health settings, but deaths across the spectrum, as I understand it. So this is your report on the CQC listening day.
That was within NHS.
Across the NHS.
Yeah.
Thank you. And then the third is the Inquest Family Consultation Day report on deaths of people with mental ill health, a learning disability or autism, more recently in 2023.
Yes, and in a way, the reason that the thing that distinguishes the two and then the consultation one was it was an opportunity for us to bring families together to see whether or not in the passage of time things had improved.
And as we've said, all three of those listening days were looking at matters on a national basis rather than focusing on any particular part of the country.
Correct.
In two of the three reports, the number of families involved is given as 11. We couldn't find a number in the third report, but is it likely to have been around the same number?
Yes, possibly a few more actually in that one.
Why, in your view, do family listening days of this sort and size provide a firm basis for conclusions or themes that you say come out of them? Is there a sufficient evidence base when you're talking to 11 or more families?
I think a very strong evidence base, and importantly, these are hearing directly from families about their experiences, but also about their recommendations for change, because one of the important things, and it goes back to my earlier point, is that many of the families who come to these days want to try and improve the situation for other families. So they have been days that involve also the organisations that commission them having to come and actually actively listen, and that can be a very powerful experience for those who are listening. And the reason why we've been commissioned to run them, we've run another one most recently in February, commissioned by the Ministry of Justice, on why we need a Hillsborough law, and we can touch on that one. That's not in this current statement. I can follow that up with you.
So these family listening days are being provided to the CQC and to government departments and so on, and being asked, they're asking Inquest for its assistance in running them.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
And I suppose importantly that families get involved because they trust the organisation, but also in the hope that they will be listened to and that listening results in change.
Understood. You say you set out at paragraph 38 a number of the themes that you say have emerged from these family listening days. In fact, you've already told us about some of them, but can we look at them? And I'll ask you to expand on one or two where you haven't already provided information to us. You start by saying in paragraph 38 that the biggest challenge for families is that they face investigatory processes which are, as you put it, exclusionary, delayed and defective. And I think you've started to tell us about that already. And then the themes that have come out of the family listening days include, first of all, that notifications of the death of their loved one are inconsistent and often insensitive. Can you briefly explain what you mean by that?
Yes, I mean that refers to the very early information that is provided, and I think the key takeaway from that is the fact that there is very little information given, and information that is sometimes given is then found to be untrue, or it's not consistent with the first version of events that was given. I think the other point to make there at those very early stages is just the information, what families describe as an information deficit, not only about how the person died, but about the processes that will follow.
Well, in fact, that's the next theme that you've given us arising out of this. And in fact, you've touched on it already as well. But not knowing, particularly if you don't have legal representation or the assistance of an organisation such as Inquest, not knowing what to expect.
No, and you're dealing, I mean, you're also dealing with, in many cases, that kind of shocking reality that your loved one is going to be the subject of a post-mortem, and dealings with a coroner. And, none of us will know what that means until, we're first confronted with it. So it is that, it is not only that information deficit, but it's also the fact that, the body of your loved one is held by a coroner until it can be released to the family to arrange a burial. And I mean, these are very distressing processes. And if you aren't told about why, to be fair, some coroners' courts, do that well. But I'm particularly talking about, I suppose, the responsibility of the organisation in whose care somebody has died to be to provide information in an accessible and sensitive way, and that is certainly quite different to what most families experience in our view.
You go on to mention that contact with representatives of the relevant NHS trust is defensive. I want to come on separately to ask you about that specifically in relation to Essex, if I may.
Okay.
And the investigations are not independent, which is a point that you've already made, and we're going to come on to look at again in a moment.
Yeah.
And that the quality of investigations can be poor, and investigations, and this is what you said, 38.6, investigations often fail to include evidence of concerns or complaints raised by families during their loved one's life. Could you expand on that, please?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we've found too often, I mean, I would include during their loved one's life and death. In other words, families of people who die in mental health settings have very often had lots and lots of engagement with mental health services, either on the journey into detention or whilst the individual is in detention, and will have raised concerns about their treatment and care. And yet they've either not been given an opportunity to raise those with investigators, or those concerns have not been addressed within the investigation.
And quite apart from complaints, there may be other relevant information that the family members may have that could be passed on that would be of relevance.
Absolutely.
You talk about the process being gruelling for the families, no doubt. Is that for all of the reasons that you've already been explaining to us?
Yeah, because I think you'll see within my statement there are lots of direct quotes, but the familiar story that we hear is that from the beginning everything feels like a fight to try and get information and to try and play a meaningful part. And that, I think, one of the things that I think our work has identified thematically is that default response of many NHS trusts and private providers to kind of denial and defensiveness and a lack of candour and a concern more about reputation management than being concerned about learning and seeking improvements.
Can I ask you this? I mean, you mentioned candour, but all of the points that you've just made, to what extent are those issues to this day?
Oh, they are issues that we are experiencing within our casework service today.
And that the last of the themes that you've explained in your statement arising from your family listening days is a reference to a lack of accountability and a failure to implement change.
Yes. Yeah.
I'd like to move now to consider one of your reports. It's called Deaths in Mental Health Detention, an Investigation Framework Fit for Purpose. Now, this is a report from 2015, I think, so around 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. It addresses mental health detention. Does that mean, for the purposes of this report, either those detained under the Mental Health Act and those de facto detained whilst being treated voluntarily as informal patients? So both categories, both formal detention and de facto detention?
Yes.
Was it looking at the national situation again, rather than any particular
It
part
was
of the country?
looking at the national picture, yeah.
Does that mean England and Wales, or just England?
No, England and Wales.
Can we look at an aspect of the report, please? Amanda, would you put up exhibits bundle page 14522, 14522? Thank you. So this is an aspect of that report, and its heading is the lack of independent investigation into deaths. And the report says this: there is a glaring disparity between the manner in which deaths in mental health detention are investigated pre-inquest compared to those in other forms of state custody. Unlike deaths in police, prison or immigration detention, or following contact with state agents, where the coroner's inquest is based on the independent investigation of the Independent Police Complaints Commission, IPCC as it was then, is that now the Independent Office for Police Conduct, or the Prisons and Probation Ombudsman, no such equivalent investigative mechanism exists to scrutinise deaths in mental health settings. Instead, the inquest is reliant pre-inquest on the internal reviews and investigations conducted by the same trust responsible for the patient's care.
Yeah.
So again, drawing attention to the differing approaches to deaths in mental health detention and those in prison, etc.
Yes, and I mean, I think there it's a question of, you know, however good an investigator might be, you know, you are effectively looking at potential failings in systems or in conduct of individuals working within the same trust. And I think it's difficult to reconcile how there was an acknowledgement of the importance of independent scrutiny for deaths in other settings, but that equivalence wasn't recognised as being important to deaths in mental health settings. And of course, the significance of that cannot be understated in terms of how it's those investigations that inform the subsequent inquest. And it's, if that is flawed, it's like the fruit from the poison tree point. It's very much the quality of the investigation that's carried out that can inform the way in which the coroner will then conduct the inquest into the death.
So this is a report from 10 years ago, but does that same point remain true to this day?
Yeah, I mean, in preparation for today, I revisited that report, which was a significant piece of research, and it was, it was probably it was the first report to actually look at these issues in any detail, and we did work with members of our inquest lawyers group, obviously from the team, but also reviewed other literature. And the reality today is no different, I would strongly suggest.
So the report includes recommendations
Yes.
for a single body conducting independent pre-inquest investigations with meaningful involvement of families in investigations. Does inquest still call for such a body, an independent investigative body?
Yes, I think we would. I think we're even more convinced of its need as we've not seen the kind of corresponding culture change within trusts and providers in terms of investigations, and also in the learning that flows from those investigations. And I think that, whilst we may well still have criticisms of the investigation bodies in deaths in prison and police custody, there is definitely an advantage about having a single body that has oversight of those investigations and can also produce bulletins around learning and draw out thematic issues. And I think, that's not also important for families and the public interest, but of course it's really important for those who have to work within settings, because I think there's often a disconnect between the information that comes out of investigations and inquests, and the sharing, dissemination of learning to people working within mental health settings.
Can I ask just some further questions about what this body might look like?
Yeah.
So you've talked about potential equivalent bodies being the IOPC or the Prisoners and Probation Ombudsman. Are you looking or suggesting something along those lines?
Yes, yeah, and a completely independent body to do that, to do those investigations, and within that, of course, there should be a function on the behalf of those who are working within those organisations to ensure that families are informed from the outset of their rights, of what the processes are, and how to play a meaningful part within those investigations.
Understood. I'm just trying to, has Inquest articulated anywhere in further detail what this body might look like?
Yes, within the 2015 report, there are some kind of suggestions as to how it might look. And I should say we're not alone in identifying this kind of disparity. The Joint Committee on Human Rights, I think even in fact prior to the publication of this report, recommended an investigation body, and I know this is something that when I was on the independent advisory panel on deaths in custody that we looked at in some detail, and I know they're currently doing some work around that.
So if we as an inquiry go back to the 2015 report and these other reports, we'll find further details, more details of what kind of body you have in mind.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Could you take that down, please, Amanda? Can we move on to look at a submission by Inquest to the Care Quality Commission, please? In October 2016, did Inquest provide a submission to the CQC review of investigations into deaths in NHS trusts?
We did, and I was also on a working group to that review, along with a number of members of our Inquest Lawyers group.
Thank you. So you provided submission. Was it addressing issues on a national basis? And was it health-wide, not confined to a mental health setting?
Yes. It was our expertise in terms of that one was largely around our work on deaths in mental health settings.
Understood. And in fact, the submission includes reference to the deaths from 2004 to 2015 of 6 inpatients by hanging at the Linden Centre in Chelmsford. It also refers to the repeated failure of NEP, the North Essex Partnership University NHS Foundation Trust, there. But could we put up exhibits bundle page 14582, please? So this is part of the submission, and we can see here structures for learning and oversight. Does it say this? Is there a quote, first of all? A lack of any national system for monitoring and oversight is allowing dangerous systems and institutions to go unnoticed and unchecked. Yes. Does it then say it should not be the continuing responsibility of families and organisations like Inquest to piece together and identify concerning patterns? And then you make 5 points within this, including at the first point, an independent national learning mechanism is needed to oversee and monitor, including for visibility and tracking around learning and recommendations arising out of deaths, both regionally and nationally, also to help inform national training programmes.
Yeah, I think we've since then we've developed a more...
Well, we'll come on to look at something soon.
Yeah.
But can I ask you this? Was this submission in part a response to what had happened in the Linden Centre and the deaths that you'd seen there?
Yes, and in fact a number of those a number of those families attended the family listening day that we were commissioned to run for the CQC to directly inform their review.
Thank you very much. Would you take that down, please? We can see later in your statement, and this is paragraph 80, that Inquest is currently calling for what's termed a national oversight mechanism.
Yeah.
Is that the same or a development of the national learning mechanism that
Yeah.
we've just been looking at there?
Yeah, that's I think a slightly more sophisticated version of what we were recommending there. I mean, this recommendation for an independent public body is born out of our frustration of seeing the same issues being repeated, the same avoidable deaths continuing, and a failure on the part of private NHS bodies and others to enact change, and in particular the accountability gap that we saw, that although now, for example, coroners' prevention of future death reports are published on the judiciary website, there is nowhere where you can track and monitor what action has actually been taken. And too often, and I think this is an important point to make, too often it's families who have to drive that culture and policy change. They will be the ones who will be trying to follow up with trusts. What have you actually done in response to the failings that have been highlighted? And so,
is that the point that you actually made in the document that we were looking at previously?
Yes.
About it shouldn't be the continuing responsibility of families and inquest to piece together and identify these patterns?
and I'm afraid to say that is the reality. And I think one of the things that doesn't help is the point I alluded to around the protracted nature of these processes. So I think what tends to happen is that you have an inquest that can be a year, several years after the death, where I think the tendency on the part of the trust is to suggest, well, that was a couple of years ago, since then everything's changed, and yet we as an organisation see deaths occurring in almost identical circumstances, and there is that lack of scrutiny of what is actually happening on the ground. And of course the National Oversight Mechanism is about collating, analysing and following up, and its ability to be able to do pieces of research, to have that kind of thematic research publications to help everybody's learning, to help inform the change that we know is needing. So that is the mechanism. That's what we've been kind of proposing. Now,
Can I ask you just about that?
Yeah.
You've used the word mechanism.
Yes.
Is this actually an organisation or a body?
yes, it's an independent public body, but I think it's important to note that it would not be a regulatory or enforcement body, because those already exist. Rather, it's an oversight body with the ability to follow up with those regulatory or enforcement bodies to encourage the action and transparency on recommendations.
I understand. May I
Yeah.
just pick up on that? Because we heard evidence last week from the former Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman, Sir Rob Berens.
Yes.
And he was talking, one of the things he spoke about was the complexity of the regulatory and complaints landscape. He talked about there being over 12 bodies or organisations that one had to contend with. Whilst what you're suggesting here may not be a regulatory body, wouldn't this, and indeed the independent investigatory body that you're calling for separately, potentially just add to the complexity of an already difficult landscape rather than have the opposite effect?
I mean, my first response to that would be, we've got to acknowledge that people are still dying avoidable deaths in places where they should be safe. Now, and that's the reality, and that should really, I think, shape everything that this inquiry is looking at and ends up recommending. I think the first point I would make is the NOM would be performing a role that doesn't exist. It doesn't exist anywhere. There is nobody who is bringing all that information into one place. So that would be my first point. And the second point would be that regulators such as the CQC or the Health Service Investigation Branch, which I do want to come on to in a minute.
We're going to look at an HSIB report, so maybe that's the time to do it.
They do not have the specific function or role of monitoring recommendations made following deaths in their stated core duties. And the only time you may well look at recommendations made in one death is if another death were to occur, and hopefully a represented family would then have a lawyer who would be able to identify the fact that these similar themes and patterns had emerged. So I think that's really important. The other thing is there's no body which sits across those different sectors to provide oversight of all of those deaths, and I think there's a lot to be, there's a lot of those cases involve multiple agencies or departments, and we need much better joined up government, and we need much better thinking across the different agencies, and we feel that new body is capable of providing that oversight as its main responsibility. And I do think that I would say that, we've been engaging at kind of high government level, policy levels on this. And there is, I think, we've certainly won the moral argument. I think people find it quite remarkable that inquiry and inquest recommendations can just disappear into the ether without anybody having central oversight and monitoring of them. And, I also think it's worth considering the public costs, the cost to the public purse of these very complex inquest and inquiry processes, when you think that the objective of a national oversight mechanism would be about learning, accountability, but absolutely importantly, system change and prevention. We need to try and do more to stop these deaths happening. And I think our proposal is informed by a lot of people coming together to think about, what that lacuna of accountability looks like, and how could we have a better system. And
do you envisage the investigatory body you've talked about being the same as part of this oversight mechanism? Could they be the same body?
No, because I think the national oversight mechanism would be concerned with all state-related deaths. I think there is still a very compelling need for an independent body to investigate deaths in mental health settings.
Thank you.
I think, I just think it's, that glaring disparity between other places of detention. Why is it that mental health patients do not have that same independent body? And I think some of the issues that I've drawn on in my statement about the lack of candour and openness and transparency could well be addressed by such a body.
Thank you. I'd like to next move on, still within the topic of investigations, to the patient safety incident response framework. I don't want to spend much time on this, but is the PSIRF for short, is its stated aim, so you cover this in paragraph 39. Is the stated aim to the NHS's approach is to develop and maintain effective systems and processes for responding to patient safety incidents for the purpose of learning and improving patient safety? And was it published in 2022, replacing the 2015 Serious Incident Framework? We understand, the inquiry understands that EPUT was the Essex Trust that we're looking at, was an early adopter of the PSIRF. And you say in your statement at paragraph 39 that whilst there have been some changes to the post-death investigation processes since inquest started holding family listening days in 2010, such as the PSIRF, our experience as an organisation is that families are continuing to raise similar concerns, and we have not seen fundamental improvements in families' experiences as a result of those changes. Could you briefly expand on that, please?
I mean, I think I will only just repeat what I've said before, that we haven't seen any noticeable improvements. And one could say in some sense there are examples of worsening practice. I mean, families still reporting remaining excluded from the process. And I think I think it's interesting to see how a number of coroners are raising concerns about poor quality investigations in their prevention of future death reports. The other thing just to mention is that the difference between the PSIRF, that's the right acronym, is that the serious incident framework required full investigations into every death, but this is no longer mandatory. So there is a concern that perhaps this new framework could dilute accountability. And, you know, I would just restate the fact that in our experience, it's still down to families and their legal representatives, if they have them, who have to really fight to play a meaningful role in the investigations that follow. And we know in regard to Essex that, of course, there have been inquests that have been going on since the review and subsequent inquiry started, where those familiar concerns have been repeated.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to move now to a new topic, and that's statistics, and we've already trailed this in your earlier evidence. But I want to look at one aspect of this first. Please put up exhibits bundle page 14522. And this is a paragraph in your report from 2015 that we've been looking at. And the title there is Statistical Background. And it says this: our findings draw on statistical data from the National Confidential Inquiry into Suicide and Homicide by People with Mental Illness, based at the University of Manchester, which publishes figures on both deaths of individuals detained under the Mental Health Act and those receiving inpatient treatment as informal patients. This is supported by information on detained patients' deaths from the IAPDC. And then the report comes on to say this: the number of deaths in mental health detention is high in comparison with other forms of custody. The most recent IAP figures show that out of 7,630 custody deaths recorded between 2000 and 2013, 4,573 deaths were of detained patients, making up 60% of the total numbers of all deaths in custody. So that's over a 14-year period. Yeah. We see a 60% proportion in relation to detained patients. May I ask you this? Has that high proportion, relatively speaking, of detained patients continued to this day?
Yes, I mean, I think with statistics, obviously they kind of, you know, they fluctuate, but I think I would suggest that you look at the most recent, and apologies, I should have put this in the statement, the most recent report by the Independent Advisory Panel still shows the concerning number of deaths of mental health in patients within their statistical bulletin.
In fact, there is a 2024 report, which I think you have provided to us, although it covers the period between 2017 and 21, and that includes this, and I quote, the mortality rate of individuals detained under the Mental Health Act remains disproportionately higher than other places of detention.
Yes. I mean, I think the frustrating thing as well is just to, you know, make the point that it's always hard with deaths of mental health inpatients, unlike, say, the deaths of people in prison and in police custody and following police contact is that the figures are always behind. I mean, we have data shared with us, for example, and I would suggest this is good practice, the Ministry of Justice share data with us on who's dying in prisons on a fortnightly basis. And, you know, the IO, the Independent Office of Police Conduct, they bring out an annual report each year, and obviously we monitor the deaths that we're working on. But we have a much, clearer understanding of who's dying in other state detention than we do for
Can we come on to consider that now, please? Could you take this down? So we saw in the David Bennett Inquiry report a recommendation about the need for better statistics, which I think is what you were about to talk about. Yeah. Did Inquest continue to argue for better statistics over the years that followed that inquiry report?
Oh yes, okay. And also I did when I was a panel member, and it's an issue that has been raised at so many of the ministerial board on deaths in custody meetings.
So, for example, the submission of evidence to the Joint Committee on Human Rights from 2003,
yeah.
Does that include a recommendation to collate and publish annual statistical information about deaths of detained patients?
Yes.
So that's 2003. The Joint Committee's report on deaths in custody, 2004. So this is, as I understand it, the report that followed on from the submission of your evidence. Yes. Did that 2004 report recommend that annual statistics should be published by the Department of Health?
Yes.
You refer in your statement to something you call the data problem. And at paragraph 45, you set out 6 different sources of data about mental health deaths that currently exist, and you provide, in relation to each, limitations.
Yes. Yeah.
Can I ask you, first of all, are those 6 sources the following? The Care Quality Commission, NKISH, which we've just seen, the National Confidential Inquiry into Suicide and Safety in Mental Health. How do you pronounce the acronym? Is it NSISH or NKISH? Or does it not matter?
I don't think it matters.
The Office for National Statistics.
Yeah.
The National Reporting and Learning System, which was replaced by Learn from Patient Safety Events. The IAPDC, and NHS England Digital.
Yeah.
So we can, the inquiry will look at all of those and what you say about them, but I do want to ask you about 2 of them, if I may.
Yeah.
First of all, the CQC and its role with regard to data. You address this at 45.1 of your statement. What do you believe the limitations are with data held specifically by the CQC?
I mean, I've referenced in the statement that the notification of patients who are subject to community treatment orders is not mandatory, so those figures are incomplete. But also, they do not include patients who weren't detained under the Mental Health Act, including those who died in the community. The other thing I would make about CQC data, and as I say, this is well evidenced and has been brought up by Inquest and others for decades, is that their data also includes a large number of what they call undetermined. I just find it incredulous that you have a CQC who can provide data with such a gap in terms of the quality of that data in telling us who is dying and where they're dying. The other thing, and apologies, this wasn't in my statement, but there's also a discrepancy that we've seen between the deaths identified by the Care Quality Commission and those deaths reported to coroners. And I would like to perhaps provide a bit more evidence on that. Because
would you follow up with that evidence?
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I also wanted to ask you about the Office for National Statistics. This is 45.3 of your statement. What is the issue in Inquest's view with the ONS mortality statistics in relation to mental health establishments?
I think it's the fact that it's qualitative and not quantitative. So it's not disaggregated in respect of particular trusts or providers, and there's no published information about causes of death or, importantly, protected characteristics. And there, I think, it's a point I made earlier on in terms of identifying trends and patterns, in terms of race, gender, ethnicity, disability, and also it's only data in relation to deaths within detention. So again, the insight into into community deaths is not there.
That does give rise to one question I did want to ask you. So you talk, for example, about the ONS data not being disaggregated.
Yeah.
Clearly, Inquest will have access to information that's in the public domain.
Yes.
But is it possible that organisations such as the ONS will actually have more data that is not disclosed and is, for example, disaggregated?
It may well be, but I mean, I think there is something really concerning that we've identified all of these different data sets, and yet we still do not have that comprehensive data set so that we all know who is dying and where they're dying. I think it's something that has just not had. I guess it's the kind of political and organisational will to do something in response to the gaps.
Well, can we pick up on that by going back to your 2015 report?
Mm-hmm.
Could you put up, please, exhibits bundle page 14560? So this is a section of that report from 2015 looking into mental health deaths, and it's entitled Collation and Publication of Statistics. Can we see here that it says the current system of publicly available statistics concerning deaths in mental health settings has developed in an ad hoc way and fails to provide a coherent source of statistical data. The lack of uniform definitions and the difference in approach applied by each body collecting data make it extremely difficult to produce a clear analysis of the figures. The failure to collate key information concerning institution, age, gender, race, or crucial features, for example, the use of force, hinders any comprehensive analytical narrative in relation to deaths in mental health settings. Now, is that picking up on the report, on the points you were just making?
Yes.
Can we see then that in bold, Inquest argues that an agreed, coherent set of published statistics is needed, which includes all information necessary to provide an overview of the number and features of deaths of mental health in patients?
Yeah.
So what did Inquest have in mind specifically where, in relation to the reference to a coherent set of statistics?
Well, exactly what we've been talking about, comprehensive data on who is dying and where people are dying and how they're dying, disaggregated. I mean, a very stark example of the challenge with this has been, we did work on the deaths of children in inpatient settings back in 2016, and we had to resort to the use of freedom of information requests because we were aware that the information we'd been provided by both the CQC and in response to parliamentary questions did not reflect the number of families with whom we were working whose children had died in mental health settings. Now, I don't think that's acceptable. We need to know. We need to have that data, and the same argument that we were making then applies today.
And you talk about the necessity of it being published rather than held by particular government departments or health bodies.
Yeah.
Thank you. So the deaths in mental health detention report that this comes from is 10 years old. Can we look at more recent information to see to what extent all of this still remains a problem? Could you take that down, please? And let's look at some more recent reports covering this issue. Dr. Geraldine Strathdeed, who was the chair of this inquiry when it was in its non-statutory phase, conducted a rapid review into data on mental health inpatient settings and produced an updated final report and recommendations in March last year. You refer to this at paragraph 43.
Yes, thank you.
I'm going to ask that part of this is put up on your screen. Could you put up exhibits bundle page 14722, please? And is that 14722? Thank you.
Yeah.
That's fine. Would you expand the top two paragraphs, please? So can we see here a section in the rapid review report entitled Data on Deaths in Mental Health Inpatient Settings?
Yeah.
What I'd like to do is look at the second of those two paragraphs, please. It says this: we found that there are several organisations that collect and report on deaths of people with mental health problems and on people with a learning disability, but that these collections are fragmented, which presents significant challenges in providing an overview of how many people die while in contact with inpatient services and the cause of their deaths. There is no published national overview of the deaths of people in inpatient mental health settings, nor of the total number of deaths of people in contact with mental health services at provider level. Does that reflect the concerns that you've been raising?
Absolutely. I mean, we met with the review team, and I think it perhaps helps you understand the frustration that Inquest feels about having raised these issues for such a long time, and still we have a situation where, you know, as recently as last year, the same issues are being flagged up as being important. I mean, I think the other important thing about the review was that it also said that the need to improve timeliness, quality and availability of data as well, because that
it produced a recommendation, didn't it, that more work was needed to map the full range of data on death, including what is collected by which organisation and what can be done to improve it.
Yeah.
And is that a recommendation that you'd agree with?
Absolutely.
Could you take that down, please? You mentioned HSIB before. We're going to come on to look at an HSIB report now, please.
Yeah.
Would you put up, Amanda, please, the exhibits bundle, page 14768? So this is the Health Services Safety Investigations Body report. It's quite recent, isn't it, from January this year,
Yes. Yep.
called Mental Health Inpatient Settings, Creating Conditions for Learning from Deaths in Mental Health Inpatient Services and When Patients Die Within 30 Days of Discharge. Could you go, please, that's the front cover, could you go, please, to page 14778? And could you expand the top two bullet points, the top of the page and the top two bullet points, please? So we can see here the report says this: examining the mechanisms that capture data on deaths and near misses across the mental health provider landscape, including up to 30 days after discharge. There's inconsistency in data reporting. Mental health providers report deaths and near misses in varied ways, using different definitions and methods. This inconsistency makes it difficult to compare data across providers and understand overall trends in patient safety. And there's not a standardised system requiring providers to report deaths in the same way. This means that each provider's reports may look different. Would you just expand the next 3 bullet points? Which reduces the reliability of data for understanding patient safety across the board. And then there's not a single comprehensive database that includes all deaths and near misses within mental health services, including those occurring within 30 days after discharge. This makes it hard to see the full picture of patient safety outcomes and identify patterns of risks. There is not a centralised organisation or process effectively overseeing and coordinating data on deaths. This lack of oversight limits the ability to identify systemic issues, reduce duplicated efforts, and drive improvements across mental health services. Are those all points with which you and Inquest would agree?
Yes.
And in fact, the report goes on to make a recommendation that the Department of Health and Social Care, working with NHS England and other relevant stakeholders, should develop a comprehensive unified data set with agreed definitions for recording and reporting deaths in mental health services to include deaths that occur within a specific time period after discharge. So the suggestion there is that responsibility for collating and centralising the data should devolve to the Department of Health and Social Care, NHS England and other key stakeholders. Do you have anything specifically in relation to that suggestion that you'd like to say?
No, only that, similar recommendations have been made before, and, I think it's deeply depressing that we're still talking about it. I would like to say one more thing about HSIB in terms of this report and what they recommend, just going back to your early question to me regarding the National Oversight Mechanism. We've had a number of meetings with HSIB because they've been doing a number of different investigations, and they became the first government agency to recommend Inquest's proposal for a national oversight mechanism, citing our briefing on the proposal from June 23 in their report. May I just read out briefly what they recommended? They wrote that HSIB recommends that the Department of Health and Social Care creates a national oversight mechanism that supports coordination, prioritisation and oversight of safety recommendations to implementation across the system. This is to ensure that recommendations from public inquiries, independent patient safety investigations and other patient safety investigation reports, as well as prevention of future death reports from inquests, are analysed, monitored and reviewed until their implementation using a continuous quality improvement approach to learning. And I think that's quite interesting, given that they are the Health Services Safety Investigation Branch.
Thank you. So that goes back to your point on the NOM, or the National Oversight Mechanism.
Absolutely. So the data is of course extremely important, but then so is the findings from investigations and inquests.
Thank you. I'd like to now come on to the last of the topics I want to deal with you, and it's data that's held by Inquest in relation to your Essex casework, and also learning a little bit more about the national picture. Mm-hmm. You referred before, we saw this, it was at paragraph 54, to there being 1,843 cases marked in your system as having been mental health related. And that was across England and Wales over the period that this inquiry is covering. Have you been able to identify cases as having involved the Essex Trust? This is paragraph 58.
Yes.
How many in total have you found?
39.
And can we just break that down a little bit? Did you analyse those 39 cases in order to determine which, in your view, came within the inquiry's terms of reference?
Yes.
Did you do that by reference to the case files themselves?
Mm-hmm.
And of those 39, did you conclude that 26 came within the terms of reference, the 26 that you've termed Group 1?
Yes.
And did you also determine that 3 further cases were likely to fall within the terms of reference and 5 further cases may do so?
Yes.
And those are your groups 2 and 3.
Yes.
In fact, if we add those all up, they come to 34 individuals, and you've referred to 39 Essex cases. Is it right that, in fact, you and Inquest determined that those further 5 didn't fall within the terms of reference, either for reasons of geography or other reasons?
That's correct.
Could we move then to consider the 26 cases that you've determined fall within the inquiry's terms of reference? Could I ask Amanda, please, for you to put up core bundle page 188? And would you expand paragraphs 59 and 60? Thank you very much. So can we see what you've said here, please, Ms. Coles, that in relation to Group 1, so those you've determined do fall within the terms of reference. In terms of time span, people in Group 1 died between 2008 and 2023. 12 are identified as female and 14 as male. 12 were aged 18 to 30 when they died. 9 were aged 31 to 60, and 5 were 61 or older. And the youngest was 18 and the eldest was 76. Is ethnicity recorded for 21 of the 26 people, of whom 1 is identified as mixed white and African heritage, and the remainder is white? And can we see then in your next paragraph, paragraph 60, in terms of location, 17 of the 26 people died during admissions to mental health wards.
Yeah.
This includes people who died whilst physically on mental health wards, those who died elsewhere, but where the incident leading to their death occurred on the relevant mental health ward, and people who died whilst on leave or after having absconded from the relevant ward. All but 2 of these 17 cases contain information confirming the relevant location. And do you then list the locations as the Linden Centre for 5 people, Basildon Hospital for 3, Rochford Hospital for 2, Broomfield Hospital for 1, the Lakes for 1, Brookfield House for 1, Derwent Centre for 1, and St Margaret's Hospital for 1. You refer there in the second or third sentence in paragraph 60 to those who died elsewhere, but where the incident leading to their death occurred on the relevant mental health ward. Could you just explain what you meant by that?
I'm in terms of that paragraph, just what it says. So there would be some people who will have been on given leave from the setting or have absconded from the ward.
Oh, I see. So an example would be an absconsion.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Could you take that down, please? I think you go on to say at paragraph 61 that 9 of the 26 in this group 1 died in the community. Yeah. Is that right?
Yes.
And similarly, did the further 8 people who came within your groups 2 and 3 also die in the community?
Yes.
I just want to acknowledge a part of your statement, please, but I don't intend to ask you questions about it. You refer in your statement, this is paragraphs 70 to 78, to people who died in HMP or Young Offender Institution Chelmsford or shortly following release, and also people who died following contact with Essex Police and in fact another police force. As I say, I want to just acknowledge that you've provided that information to the inquiry. I want to say that the inquiry wants to consider that information in further detail, and we'll be asking you for some further information to allow us to consider to what extent these people fall within our terms of reference.
Yeah, I think the significance there is in terms of the trust and the provision of mental health services at the time.
Yeah. So can we look now at your paragraph 64? And would you please put up core bundle page 189, please? Do we see here Inquest's involvement in Essex cases demonstrates that most of the common features identified in Inquest's report in February 2015, is that the report we've just been looking at several times, the deaths in mental health detention report.
Yes.
And which inquest has witnessed nationally are also apparent in Essex cases. And we'll come on in a moment to look at those points that you go on to make. Could you take that down, please? So are all of the trends that you go on in your statement to outline evident in inquests, Essex casework specifically, Essex?
Yes, but they are also familiar to us in terms of the national picture.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Would you help us with the trends that you've identified? First of all, can we see at 64.1, poor systems for information sharing and communication? And would you just very briefly explain what you mean by that?
I mean, this is such a familiar one. I mean, the significance around staff sharing important information about patients, lack of information between different teams involved in an individual's care, and poor risk assessments.
Well, that takes us on, doesn't it, actually, to your next point,
Yeah,
which is
observation.
failures in understanding of and compliance with basic policies and procedures, including, as you've just said, around risk assessments and observations. I want to ask you a little bit about the next point, poor record keeping, including falsification.
Yeah.
Would you just explain particularly about falsification?
I mean, I think the situation, I think, is well known within the Essex context, but with people just falsifying very significant safety records.
You refer actually later in your statement, in relation specifically to Essex,
Yes.
to a high prevalence of falsified observation records.
Yes. I mean, if you think about the importance of observations to people who are particularly vulnerable and not least to self-harm and self-inflicted death, then, you know, observations are absolutely critical. And of course, you know, to then see falsification does speak to a very worrying culture, I think.
Well, we'll come on to that perhaps in a moment. You also refer to inadequate staffing levels and inappropriate skill mixes, inadequate levels of clinical oversight, inadequate treatment and response to dual diagnosis needs, poor treatment of physical health, high levels of absconsion, and poor implementation of missing persons policies, poor communication with families, particularly around care and risk factors, unsafe environments, inadequate emergency medical responses, failures to provide any therapeutic input, oxyvision, lack of autism-specific provision, failures in early intervention, inappropriate follow-up or provision following presentation at A&E, and inappropriate decisions to discharge patients, and lack of trauma-informed, gender-sensitive and culturally sensitive care, leading to care which is at odds with the person's needs and which can lead to further trauma and harm. So a wide-ranging group of themes that you set out there.
Yes.
There's one that I want to come on to particularly, which you then cover at paragraph 65. And you talk here about a closed culture. You say this, paragraph 65, our organisational experience of the Essex cases has been particularly striking in evidencing the existence of a closed culture within EPUT and its predecessor trusts. What do you mean by a closed culture?
I mean, we've used in here the definition that the CQC use, which is, you know, around a poor culture that can lead to harm, including human rights abuse, breaches such as abuse. And I think one of the most shocking aspects of our work is the disconnect between what one imagines therapeutic care and support of people who are in distress or experiencing trauma and the reality of their experiences. Now, I know that the inquiry has seen the dispatches programme, and I think clearly, you know, that was an extremely disturbing spotlight on a culture that was clearly very unhelpful, and when I say unhelpful, I mean, I should have said unhealthy in the context of what you would expect.
Can I pick up on that? Because you
Yes.
mentioned dispatches
Yes.
specifically in your statement in connection with abuse.
Yes.
But you also mentioned, and this is at 65.1, lack of compassion or empathy in the delivery of care. Could you expand on that, please?
I think the evidence that we've seen that has come out of so many inquests is about the lack of trauma-informed care and support for people who are highly distressed, and the kind of cultures of disbelief or seeing behaviour as somehow manipulative or attention-seeking, and some extremes of that have, in terms of people believing that somebody's potential kind of dying moments are feigning unconsciousness, or just not recognising people's distress, and the staff's desensitisation in having a compassionate response.
Can I ask you about that?
Yeah.
To what extent does your casework reveal a compassion fatigue amongst staff?
I think it does reveal that. I think too many settings seem to be more concerned with containment and control rather than healing and therapeutic care and recovery. And I think there are perhaps some important kind of questions to be asked about how have those cultures developed. That raises questions about leadership. It raises questions about staff's access to training, to therapeutic support themselves, because we know that this is not easy work. But if the actual physical environment is not a healthy one, then you then get the corresponding kind of behaviour. But some of the behaviour that we've seen, manifests itself in unnecessary and frequent use of restraint. Now, my view of that would be, if you have a setting that has high levels of the use of restraint, that to me suggests that's not a healthy therapeutic culture.
Thank you. You've mentioned a number of different things there.
Yes.
First of all, I want to say this. Thank you for explaining the further areas that the inquiry should be looking at. I can tell you that all of those are captured within our list of issues. But it is one of the points that we need to be looking beyond the ward and up to the leadership of the trust to be really getting a full picture of what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the other point I wanted to ask you about is this. I mean, you've mentioned closed culture specifically in the context of Essex, or it being a particular issue in Essex. Were the points that you've been making specific to Essex, or do they also resonate on a national basis?
I think the points I was making were specific to Essex, but I would suggest that many of those points apply nationally. And I mean, I think it's important to say that, we've got decades of experience of seeing traumatic experiences of families and their dealings with trusts and private providers, both when their loved one was alive, but then that extends to that closed culture in the conduct of staff and their legal representatives post-death. And that is the culture I was talking about earlier.
Can I pick up on that, please?
Yeah.
Could you put up, please, core bundle page 167? And I'd like to end on this, please. This is your paragraph 21. So can I just read that? Although there have been some changes to the availability of data and to the frameworks governing post-death investigations, the grim reality is that the barriers to improving patient safety following deaths today remain fundamentally the same. There is a lack of comprehensive data to allow us to see exactly who is dying and where, and the system for post-death investigation is ill-equipped to tell us why. So that is encapsulating two of the main points that you've been making today, as I understand it.
Yes, and I don't want to kind of underestimate the point about the cultures of defensiveness.
Well, can we come on to that, please?
Yeah.
Because this paragraph continues, particularly in circumstances where there is no appetite on the part of the NHS Trust or independent provider to examine deficiencies in their care, and nowhere has the effect of institutional defensiveness on patient safety been more clearly illustrated than in Essex.
Yes.
Can I ask you one technical question? Well, first of all, to what extent does Inquest's experience extend to private providers?
It does. We work,
Thank you. And this picks up on what you've just been saying, I think, but what is the basis for saying that the effect of institutional defensiveness on patient safety has been most clearly illustrated in Essex?
I think through our experience of working with families and viewing the conduct of the trust and lawyers representing the trust at inquests, and just seeing how the main focus of those trusts seems to be is about protecting their reputation, defending their policies and practices, even when they're indefensible. And rather than being open, and I think there's something about, in a way, it's about, a commitment to truth and to social justice requires public institutions to behave honestly and openly and to accept where they have failed, where they have failed in their duties to protect somebody's life and where they have not provided the therapeutic care that I referred to earlier. And that has been seen in, I think, with Essex particularly, lack of issues around, and I illustrate some of this in my statement, the lack of disclosure or late disclosure.
And as you've already said about fabrication of evidence.
Yes. And coroners and juries making findings that evidence given by EPUT staff was not in fact true. And I mean, I think, being realistic here, the very fact we are sitting in a statutory public inquiry is because of the lack of candour on the part of Essex at a senior management level and staff level to cooperate with the previous independent review. And it's difficult to say how traumatising that is for families when they're sitting at an inquest which is being given as their opportunity to find out the truth, to hear directly from those in whose care their loved one died, and then see legal representatives try and effectively stop a coroner from making a prevention of future death report, which is ultimately about trying to safeguard lives in the future.
Thank you.
I find that reprehensible, actually. I think, we're talking here about trying to protect lives and also remember those who've died where those deaths were preventable. And we owe that really to not only to those who've died, but also to their families. And that's not just in the family's interest, but it's in the public interest. All of us are impacted by learning and accountability. It's in all of our interests to have that openness and transparency.
Thank you very much. Chair, I have no more questions at this point for Ms. Coles. Unless you do, may I suggest that we break for 10 minutes and reconvene to see if there's any further questions? Thank you. Chair, just a couple of more questions for Ms. Coles.
Yes.
Ms. Coles, we spoke briefly about the duty of candour
Yes.
Before the break. In your view, and in the view of Inquest, is that properly being discharged within Essex?
No.
And is that for the reasons that you've explained before the break?
Yes.
And in your view, is the duty of candour properly being discharged on a national basis within mental health trusts?
No. And it's one of the reasons why a lot of my statement talks to the culture of defensiveness that we see across the country, the cover-ups that we've seen in some cases, and the importance of Hillsborough law in bringing about an enforceable legal duty of candour on public authorities, public servants and corporations who hold responsibility for public safety. And of course, mental health settings are absolutely fundamental to that.
Thank you very much. My last question is this. You're probably aware of this. There was a House of Lords Select Committee considering the statutory public inquiries, which reported last year. And in fact, there's a government response from February this year.
Yep.
Just coming back to monitoring, one of the issues that was raised before the Select Committee was for a formal implementation monitoring role to be undertaken by a new joint Select Committee of Parliament, which they termed the Public Inquiries Committee. So you've referred to a national oversight mechanism.
Yes.
Here we've got a slightly different option, as I understand it. Could you give us your take on what was being recommended there, please?
I mean, I gave evidence alongside somebody from the Institute of Government on that, and we listened. I mean, we've considered carefully that recommendation, and we would suggest that the independent body would be accountable to a parliamentary committee, but don't believe that the function should be solely aligned to Parliament because of the capacity and changing nature of select committee memberships. So I think we're also talking about, the benefit, I think, of a national oversight mechanism is that it is concerned with state-related deaths, it is concerned with deaths in custody and detention, as well as other deaths that raise questions about state and corporate accountability, and that body can better analyse, follow up, produce thematic reports and inform parliamentary committees.
So you mentioned that it would be answerable to a select committee. Do you have one in mind?
Well, the challenge in that is, of course, that these issues cut across so many different departments. I think we have thought of perhaps the Joint Committee on Human Rights. You may remember that Dame Eilish Angelini conducted a review looking at deaths in and following police custody. And she recommended at the time an Office of Article 2 compliance because she recognised that these were deaths that engaged Article 2 of the Human Rights Act. And I think we were thinking that possibly that committee, that's notwithstanding a committee being set up that could have this as part of its function, but I don't think that a select committee or liaison committee, which they're recommending, is enough.
Thank you very much. Chair, do you have any further questions?
No, thank you.
Those are all the questions we have for you, Ms. Coles. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We'll rise now until 2 o'clock, please.